All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling MVPs.
Minimum viable products.
Right, those streamlined versions you test out before going all in on a product launch.
Exactly.
We've got some really interesting sources here, advice from some real startup veterans,
Yeah.
and stories about how some pretty big companies.
Huge company.
Yeah, huge. Started with just a simple MVP.
You know, what I find really fascinating about this whole MVP approach is that it represents a real shift in how people think about building products.
How so?
Well, instead of trying to make everything perfect right out of the gate, it's about experimenting.
Right.
Embracing the fact that you don't have all the answers right away.
Yeah.
And learning as you go.
And our sources really stress that even at this super early stage, having a clear vision for your product is key.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the founders we read about put it perfectly.
How'd they say it?
It's better to make a few people really happy than a lot of people semi-happy.
That's such a great quote.
It is, right. And that seems to be a common thread among the successful MVPs we looked at.
Makes sense.
It does, yeah.
You're really trying to wow those early adopters, the folks who are always eager to try new things and are willing to accept a few imperfections.
As long as it solves their problem.
Exactly. They're the ones who are desperate for a solution.
They're the ones with their hair on fire, right?
Exactly. Like they'd use a brick to put out a fire.
Yeah, if they couldn't find a fire extinguisher.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how you actually build an MVP.
All right.
Our sources break it down into three main approaches.
Let's hear them.
Human automation,
Okay.
no-code tools,
Yep.
and then just your classic full code route.
Got it.
Let's start with that first one.
Human automation.
Yeah. So the idea is that humans actually do the work behind the scenes to simulate what you eventually want to automate.
Interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was a really clever way to see if there's even demand for your product before you invest in building some crazy tech.
Makes sense.
So like imagine you're creating a service to give sales leads to web developers.
Okay.
Instead of creating a complicated web scraping engine,
Right.
you could just gather leads manually and give them to your clients.
I see.
It's not something you could do at scale, of course,
Right.
but it lets you test that core idea.
Which is?
Are web developers actually willing to pay for these leads?
Clever.
Right.
Yeah.
It's all about finding those creative workarounds.
Absolutely.
Now, for those who aren't so comfortable with coding, our sources say no-code tools are a game changer.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Platforms like Airtable, Zapier,
Yep.
and Bubble let you build functional products without writing any code.
It's pretty amazing how much these platforms have changed the game.
They really have.
We came across the story of a podcast producer
Oh, yeah.
who built this whole system for managing their podcast and YouTube production,
Wow.
all in Airtable.
No coding. Yep. That's incredible.
It is.
But of course, if you've got the skills and resources.
You can always go the full code route.
Exactly.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that for founders who aren't technical,
It can be really tough.
oh, for sure, especially finding good developers to partner with.
Or even just figuring out which agency to trust.
Definitely.
But regardless of how you choose to build it.
There's one thing you've got to remember.
What's that?
Your MVP is not,
Yeah.
it's not just a simplified version of your final product.
It's about figuring out the absolute minimum you need to test a specific hypothesis.
Nailed it.
Like Zappos, for example.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of building this huge e-commerce platform right away,
Right.
the founder just bought shoes from local stores to fulfill online orders.
So he was basically the middleman.
Exactly.
Wow.
It was a super scrappy way to do it.
It was.
But it proved that people were actually willing to buy shoes online.
Smart.
And it let Zappos test that idea without investing a ton of money in tech they might not have even needed.
It's amazing how many companies started out like that, just super scrappy.
Speaking of which,
Yeah.
let's look at some other famous companies and their MVPs.
Met these stories.
They're so inspiring.
They are?
Like Airbnb, for instance.
Okay.
They started as a really niche platform.
How so?
Well, they only catered to conferences.
Interesting.
They didn't even have a payment system.
No way.
Or a map view.
Wow.
And get this, guests had to sleep on airbeds.
You're kidding.
Nope. It's crazy to see how far they've come since then.
It really goes to show you don't need to have a perfect product to start. You can start small.
Solve one specific problem.
Yep.
And then iterate based on what your users tell you. Another cool one is this really popular streaming platform that started with just one person.
No way.
Yeah. And no video games.
Really?
And the technology to stream back then was super expensive.
Wild.
And you've got this super popular online payment platform.
Yeah.
Back in the day, they didn't have any fancy partnerships with banks.
Interesting.
They had to do all this paperwork manually every night to set up accounts,
Wow.
and they only had a very limited set of features.
It's amazing how far they've come.
It's crazy, right? Makes you realize even the biggest companies started out small.
It really does challenge that whole myth that these companies just started out perfect.
Exactly.
The truth is, even something as iconic as the first iPhone
Oh, yeah.
had its limitations.
Like what?
No app store.
Seriously?
No video recording.
No way.
Yep, and it was stuck with slow 2G internet.
Mind-blowing to think how much those limitations shaped the iPhone we know today
Absolutely.
and how it influenced the entire smartphone industry.
Crazy to think about.
It really is.
So it seems like building a good MVP is all about finding that balance.
Balance between.
Moving fast and making sure your product is good enough that people will actually want to use it.
And our sources highlight 4 key things that make an MVP successful.
Hit me with them.
First, it's got to target a specific audience.
Okay.
Second, it needs to address a problem that's really important to that audience. Third, it has to have a good user experience.
Makes sense.
And fourth, it has to be something you can build and launch quickly.
Got it.
So speed is super important.
Yeah.
But, as you said, it can't come at the expense of the user experience.
Exactly.
Even in this limited version, you've got to maintain high-quality code, design, and content.
Absolutely.
So how do you do that?
How do you build a great MVP fast without sacrificing quality?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
It is.
Well, our sources really stress the importance of setting strict deadlines to keep the scope small.
Okay.
So you basically have to decide what those must-have features are
Right.
and ruthlessly cut anything else that's not absolutely necessary to test your core hypothesis.
Makes sense.
And don't be afraid to build features manually at first.
Yeah.
You can always automate them later once you've proven your idea.
Good point.
I think this is where a lot of founders get tripped up, though.
How so?
You have to resist the urge to fall in love with your MVP.
I see what you mean.
It's meant to evolve and change based on what you learn from your users.
It's a stepping stone.
It's
It's our tool for learning.
not a finished product.
Right. So before we move on, I just wanted to kind of add to that last point about not falling in love with your MVP.
Yeah.
It's really important to be ready to let go of some of your ideas,
Mm-hmm.
even if you're really attached to them.
Yeah.
If the data is telling you it's just not working.
It's tough. But you got to kill your darling sometimes.
You do.
Speaking of users, though,
Yeah.
one thing that stood out to me from all our sources was how important it is to target the right people with your MVP.
Oh, absolutely.
Those early adopters, right?
Yep, the folks who are always looking for the next big thing.
They're hungry for new solutions.
And they're willing to give something a try, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah, they're not expecting a flawless product.
Right.
They just want something that solves their problem.
Exactly.
And they're willing to be patient while you work out the kinks
They're the ones giving you that invaluable feedback.
and helping you make your product better.
Exactly.
They're almost like partners in the development process.
I like that. Yeah, partners.
Right.
One of the experts we read about had this great analogy for early adopters.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine your hair's on fire.
Okay. That's a pretty urgent situation.
It is.
Right.
And someone comes along and offers you a brick
A brick.
as a solution.
I mean, it's not a fire extinguisher.
It's not ideal, but
In that moment,
when you're desperate,
yeah.
you might just take it.
Right, you try anything.
Exactly.
So early adopters are like the person with their hair on fire.
They are. They're so desperate for a solution that they'll try anything.
They'll even use a brick.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you find these people, these early adopters?
How do you make sure your MVP is getting in front of the right eyes?
Well, our sources all agree that understanding your target audience is crucial.
Oh, absolutely.
You need to know what their needs are.
What are the pain points?
What are they already doing to try and solve those problems?
Right, and then you need to explain how your MVP can help them in a way that really resonates.
Yeah, you're not selling a finished product here.
We're offering a solution to a problem.
One investor we read about said one of the biggest mistakes founders make is launching too late.
Interesting.
They spend so much time trying to perfect their product that they miss the chance to get feedback from real users.
It's that classic analysis paralysis.
Right, they get stuck in their own heads.
They can spend months, years even,
building in isolation.
and then they finally launch.
And realize their perfect product doesn't actually solve anyone's problem.
Ouch.
Yeah, that's got to be tough.
But even if you found the right audience,
And you have a great product.
gathering feedback and knowing what to do with it can be tricky.
Absolutely.
So what did our sources have to say about that?
Well, one of the key takeaways was to go beyond just surveys and questionnaires
Okay.
and actually watch how people use your MVP.
See what they do,
where they get stuck,
what they like.
what frustrates.
You're basically a detective.
Looking for clues in their behavior.
Exactly.
And don't be afraid to ask open-ended questions.
Like what?
Like, what was their overall experience?
Okay.
What were they hoping to achieve?
So not just prompting them with specific features?
What? Let them tell you in their own words.
It all goes back to that idea of not falling in love with your MVP.
Yep.
It's a learning experience.
A scientific experiment.
Where you're constantly testing and refining your ideas based on what the data is telling you.
One entrepreneur had this to say about launching an MVP.
Okay, what's the quote?
Don't be afraid to launch something that's ugly.
Haha, I like that.
Your early adopters won't judge you for it, and the feedback you get will be infinitely more valuable than months of tinkering in isolation.
So true.
It's a good reminder that getting your MVP out there,
even if it's not perfect,
is way more valuable than waiting for the perfect moment.
Totally agree.
And there's also the question of how we view a launch.
What do you mean?
Well, traditionally, it's this big event. Right.
But one of our sources argued that we should really think of it as a continuous process.
Interesting.
Instead of focusing on this one grand reveal.
You're constantly experimenting and iterating.
Exactly.
So it's not about this one big moment.
Right. It's about ongoing improvement.
They also pointed out that most initial launches actually go unnoticed.
Really?
Yeah. So all that hype might be misplaced.
So even a quiet launch can give you valuable data.
That you can then use to improve your product.
Make it better.
And refine your message.
It's all about learning and adapting.
Exactly.
The sources also highlighted the importance of experimenting with different launch channels.
Oh, for sure.
Each channel is going to attract a slightly different audience.
It's like fishing in different ponds.
Yeah.
You got to use different bait to catch different fish.
Exactly.
So trying different platforms.
Like what?
Whether it's an online community, social media,
or even just reaching out to people directly,
can help you figure out where your ideal users are and how they respond to your message.
Makes sense.
They shared this really interesting story about how a popular social news website got its start by being shared among the founders of a well-known startup accelerator.
Wow.
It was this super targeted launch
within a specific community
that gave them incredibly valuable feedback early on.
Really goes to show you the power of niche communities.
And using the networks you already have to get your MVP in front of the right people.
Absolutely.
They also cautioned against staying in that friends and family launch phase for too long.
Why is that?
Well, it's great to get initial feedback from people you know.
Of course.
But they might not be representative of your target market.
Right. Their feedback could be biased.
They might not want to hurt your feelings.
Exactly.
So you need to get your MVP in front of strangers who have no stake in your success.
People who will give you honest feedback.
That's when you'll get the most valuable insights.
For sure.
And that brings us to platforms like Hacker News.
Okay.
Product Hunt. Or even certain communities on Reddit or Facebook.
Those can be really valuable for getting your MVP in front of a wider audience.
Especially a more tech-savvy audience.
Exactly.
They told this great story about a popular stock trading app.
What happened?
So they were getting ready for this big launch.
Okay.
And then someone posted about them on Hacker News completely randomly.
No way.
Yeah, and they ended up getting thousands of signups.
Before they even officially launched? Sometimes you just get lucky.
I guess so.
But even with all that, they also emphasize that press coverage isn't everything.
Oh, interesting.
Getting featured in a big publication might give you a temporary boost.
But it's not going to make or break your business.
It's not a silver bullet.
What matters is building a community around your product.
People who believe in what you're doing.
And who will stick with you through the ups and downs.
And that brings us to another crucial aspect of launching and iterating on your MVP.
What's that?
Measuring your success.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into minimum viable products.
We've covered a lot of ground. From the whole philosophy behind MVPs to different ways to actually build them. The importance of finding those early adopters.
Right.
And how launching a product is really an ongoing process.
It is.
So now let's tackle the big question.
Which is?
How do you measure whether your MVP is actually successful?
It all comes down to data, right?
It does.
But it's easy to get overwhelmed by all those numbers.
Oh, yeah. You can drown in data if you're not careful.
Our sources really emphasize that you need to focus on the right metrics.
The ones that actually matter.
It's easy to get caught up in those vanity metrics.
The numbers that look impressive.
But don't really tell you anything useful about your product.
Exactly.
You need to look at the actionable metrics.
The data points that tell you how people are actually using your MVP.
And help you make smart decisions about what to do next.
Right.
So give me some examples.
What kind of metrics should we be paying attention to?
Well, one of the most important ones is conversion rates.
Oh, okay. Tell me more about that.
So basically, it measures how well your MVP is turning visitors into users.
So like how many people who visit your website actually sign up for an account?
Exactly.
Or subscribe to your service.
Or make a purchase.
Right.
If you have a high conversion rate.
It means people are finding your MVP valuable.
They're convinced enough to take that next step.
But if it's low,
it could mean there's a problem with your messaging.
Or the user experience.
Or maybe even the core value proposition of your product.
Got it.
Another key metric our sources mentioned was retention rate.
How many people stick around after they try your MVP?
Exactly.
Retention is so important.
It is.
It tells you if you're actually solving a problem for people.
And if they're engaged enough to keep using your product.
It's like a restaurant.
Okay, I like this analogy.
You might have a packed house on opening night.
Everyone's excited to try the new place.
But if the food's bad...
And the service is terrible.
No one's coming back for seconds.
Makes sense.
High retention rates are a really strong indicator of what we call product market fit.
What does that mean?
It means you're on the right track.
Your product is resonating with your target audience?
Hey.
Our sources also talked about the importance of tracking feature usage.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
So you can see which features people are actually using.
And which ones they're ignoring.
It gives you really valuable insights into their needs and preferences.
It's like peeking behind the curtain and seeing how people are actually interacting with your product.
You can see what they find helpful.
And what they find frustrating.
And that can help you prioritize your development efforts.
Absolutely.
Focus on the things that matter.
And cut the stuff that's just adding bloat.
Makes sense.
But remember, all this quantitative data,
all those numbers,
it's important to balance that with qualitative feedback.
What do you mean?
Talking to your users.
Getting their thoughts and opinions in their own words. Numbers can tell you a lot.
But they don't always explain why people are doing what they're doing.
So you need that direct feedback from users to get the full picture.
To understand the context behind those numbers.
Whether it's through surveys, interviews, or in-app feedback tools.
Whatever works best for you.
The point is to get that qualitative data to complement the quantitative data.
And remember, analyzing all this data and gathering feedback.
It's not a one-time thing.
It's an ongoing process.
As you iterate on your MVP.
You need to keep monitoring those metrics.
Keep talking to your users.
And be ready to adjust course as needed.
It's like sailing a ship.
Ooh, I like that.
You have to constantly adjust your sails based on the wind and the currents.
To reach your destination.
And the destination for your MVP is product market fit.
That sweet spot where your product is solving a real problem.
For a big enough market.
To sustain your business.
But even when you reach that point,
the journey's not over.
You have to keep evolving your product.
Stay ahead of the competition.
And adapt to the changing needs of your users.
It's all about continuous improvement.
Always striving to make your product better.
More valuable for your users.
Well said.
Building a successful product is a marathon.
Not a sprint.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've reached the finish line of our deep dive into minimum viable products.
It's been quite a journey.
It has.
Exploring this whole world of MVPs.
From those first sparks of an idea.
To launching and refining your product based on what you learned from your users.
We hope you found this deep dive valuable.
We really enjoyed sharing these insights with you.
Now we'd love to hear from you.
Our listeners.
Have you ever built an MVP?
What did you learn along the way?
What advice would you give to other entrepreneurs who are just starting out on this journey?
Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive,
please consider subscribing to the show.
And giving us a like.
It really helps us reach more curious minds like yours.
Until next time.
Keep learning.
Keep experimenting.
And keep building amazing things.